Greetings and welcome once again to Aspects of Aliyah, brought to you from an extremely cold, wet and windy United Kingdom. So welcome to session 3 of what I believe will be quite a long series on prophecy. That is to say, the way that God communicates with man, primarily through his elect nation, Israel. The first 2 sessions were very much by way of an introduction to the subject. So for the next few minutes, I will just finish that introduction, then we'll look at who the prophets were. Who were they? What were they communicating over the next few weeks? But first and essentially, who were these people and how did they appear and what they were doing? So just to finish the introduction, we look very much at Tanakh, but we need to just speak very briefly about the Second Temple period. This, as you are very aware, was when the canonical scriptures supposedly finished round about 400 BCE. Now the Judaisms, and I use the plural advisedly, dreams have more or less taken over from general prophecy and were recognised as the via media of divine wisdom, although they were strictly controlled. In the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, it says this: "A man of no understanding has vain and false hopes, and dreams give wings to fools. As one who catches a shadow and pursues a wind, so is he who gives heed to dreams." So they speak about a little bit more about the value of dreams, and they go on to say, unless dreams are sent from Most High as visitation, is very careful, because dreams have deceived many, and those who put the hope in dreams have failed. So there's a great mass controversy about dreams, visions, divine visitations, and we didn't mention it previously, the visitations from the dead, such as Saul and the witch at Endor. We won't pass ourselves from that, but what we will be speaking about as we go along are not only authentic prophets, but also false prophets. So in the Second Temple period, the idea of divine revelation was a little bit mixed up. For the 2nd century, prophecy was generally considered to have finished altogether, and shall we put it this way, dreams and what we might call visions replaced by apocalyptic writings. Now, we spoke about these apocalyptic writings at some length in some of our earlier broadcasts, so I don't really want to overstress this. But within the New Testament period, and the overall final redactions of the Tanakh, apocalyptic writings played a big part in the thinking of the time. Now, in the Second Temple period, these writings were very influential on the thought of people who lived in the town of Yeshua. The main writings are the oracles of Ispastes, the Didache in chapter 16, Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter, 5 and 6 Ezra, Sibylline Oracles, the Book of Elakasai, and various others. We could go on to name 12 or 15 more of these. Just like to bring that to an end there. So, the means of revelation, what we might call direct prophecy, by divine meeting, by visions, dreams, angelic visitations, and dreams, as I said again, can't overemphasize this one. But by the time we get to 100 years before New Testament, the apocalyptic genre is rather certain from this, and many of them are described as dreams or visions. So, I think I've managed in this first 5 or 6 minutes to close the general introduction. We could do 3 or 4 broadcasts and programs on these things, but I think that is probably enough said on these matters. I hope and suppose, like myself, probably like to get into the nitty-gritty of these things rather than a massive introduction. However, I've got to say, if we don't have the introduction, we probably won't understand. We will not understand what is actually being said unless we know the background of these things, because they might be taken literally or be taught in wrong or non-meaningful manners. So over these next weeks, I'd like to speak about my own divisions of prophecy, and then we'll look at some individuals. Some are not very exciting, some are largely ignored, some aren't even recognised, some we have very little or scant information. We have to be careful not to make overwhelming assumptions from these things. So I'd like to propose 4 initial divisions and possibly a 5th. So I'd like to suggest that the first division is actually non-writing prophets. Oh, really? Yes. There are several prophets who never wrote a word. There's no record of an amanuensis or a scribe or disciple writing these things in extent. But these prophets were very, very influential, very persuasive, and the teachers very pervasive in their lifetimes. Now, there are more than these. Some are questionable, but these are the main ones. So I'd like to just think about these for a moment, and then we'll talk about some of them in later programs. So, these are not in a particular order, but they are in order of what we might call priority. It's too easy to make lists from the way that they appear in the Tanakh or Old Testament, in the New Testament, because these things are not written as historical documents. They're presented to us in divisions That's Torah, obviously, the prophets, the writings, and various other ways that these scriptures are presented to us in various publications. So these are not in a chronological order, but they're in an order of what we might call importance. So the very first prophet that has to be considered, obviously, is Moses. Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moses is probably the most interesting one within limits because of, firstly, the time that he appears. If you look at his meetings with God, particularly panim mapanim, face to face, this is a slightly different dimension. So we'll be doing a whole program on Moses, maybe the next one or one after this. So we got Moses. Now, was Moses a non-writing prophet? That's the first thing. Now, several questions arise around this, but I'd like to deal with these in the next program that will be dedicated to him. But it's sufficient to say there was literacy around at the time of Moses. But did Moses actually write the Torah? Highly unlikely, because he talks about his birth, and he certainly wasn't there then, and various other things. But it's sufficient to say that the things that are attributed to Moses were probably part of oral history that we've spoken about at some length earlier, but there certainly may well have been some written resources from the life and times of Moshe. However, if these were written on papyrus, they certainly wouldn't have lasted very long at all, because the materials were extremely perishable. So we're going to take the middle ground with Moshe. I'm going to designate him as a non-writing prophet on the very simple basis that I don't think he sat down with a sharpened stick or a piece of metal and a load of clay tablets and wrote it down himself. Okay? So bear with this, but we'll speak about it earlier. So obviously the greatest prophet and the greatest hero of Judaism is probably Moshe. So let's just move on a little bit from there. So, I suppose the next one we probably need to look at is probably one of the female prophets, Miriam, but we'll talk about her under the separate heading. So what we're going to look at is 4 divisions. Non-writing prophets, female prophets, yes, female prophets, major prophets, minor prophets, to which I'm going to add intertestamental prophets, which is the apocalyptic genre, and also New Testament prophets. And then to finish off with, we'll probably look at Paul's version and understanding of prophecy, assuming that we have enough time and also enough patience. I personally am very thrilled about this series that we're embarking on, and I do hope that you'll bear with me as we go along, because understanding the prophetic dimension of Judeo-Christianity will bring us to a much closer relationship with God, a much closer relationship with Yeshua, and a much closer relationship with reality, the ministry that we give our lives to. So, we'll take a break here, and we'll just run very quickly, before we start on them in a great way, on the non-writing prophets and the female prophets. So, we'll join again in a minute or two.
If you are a Christian then there is no question that you owe a great debt to the Jewish people. Unto them were entrusted the oracles of God. What does that mean? It means, if not for the faithfulness of the Jewish people, we would not have this. And therefore you would not know your God, and you would not know his Son.
Israel and the Jewish people are under attack right now, and we owe them everything. The least that we can do is support them in their hour of need. So please go to EzraInternational.org and give to the Emergency Relief Fund, and your dollars will be used to help displaced and traumatized Jewish people throughout the land.
And remember, if you do nothing, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jewish people from another place. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Please go to EzraInternational.org and give your best gift today.
Welcome back to Aspects of Aliyah as we continue to look at the subject of prophecy. So, when we look at the anthropology of Israel, anthropology is just a posh word in a sense for history, in its social sense, and the way that people related to God, lands and people, which in the forthcoming multi-volume or single volume of Towards the Theology of Israel will be explained at great length. So, even though she appears twice in our list, we have Devorah, who appears in Judges, who really was quite a character and very unique. But once we move more or less out of the period of the Judges and we start moving into the first, and I use this advisedly, the first elements of the monarchy, we're also going to find another lady prophet, but we'll speak about her as we go along. But we find Samuel, prophet and priest, remarkable character. Then when we come into the other times, we find Nathan, we find David, King David, we find Micaiah. There's two of those, but Micaiah and Ben-Imlah will be one. We find the unnamed prophet in this wonderful story about this trip, Balaam, his donkey, and all kinds of things like this. Ahijah, Azariah, the unnamed man of God in the house of Eli, which goes back into the time of the prophecy. So if I got these unnamed prophets, we won't look at all of them at some length, but some of the more important ones we will. So let's just run these few by you just for reference. Moshe, Devorah, but also, very importantly, Elijah and Elisha. What phenomenal men they were. Didn't write anything. We have great records of the way that they spoke to kings and people on behalf of the Lord. The way that invading forces were spoken to them by the word of God. Phenomenal histories. And we shouldn't disregard them just simply because they didn't write anything down. We have records from various people who did record. And then we could also talk about, we may need to speak about this, about the missing books of the Bible. Or missing, shall we call them better missing records? We've found all these things. Are these things not in the book of Yashar? Are these things not written in the books of Chronicles of the Kings of? We don't have these, they're lost. But we can reclaim some of the things that were written there from notices that appear in other writings. So, Elijah, Elisha, Micaiah, Nathan, Samuel, David is a prophet as well as a psalmist, and a king and a warrior. We could also probably even include Saul in there, because we're told that he joined with a band of prophets and prophesied. What he said we don't know, there's no record. But that spirit of prophecy came on. There were those of the schools of the prophets. We have no records of what they said particularly. But you know that prophecy was alive, it was a dynamic element in the days of the judges and the days of the kings, and even in the days of what I'm going to call Israeli dominance. I'm not going to use the word Israeli or Jewish empire when we're speaking about David and Solomon. It was dominance. For an empire to be an empire, it has to have a very organised system, minor kings, satraps, organisations, separate, all those kind of things. These things were not part of it. It was Israeli dominance through military might and economic power. These little asides, but as we're discussing our scriptures, we need to make sure that we don't make false assumptions, because one false assumption will invariably lead to another. So, we've got the unnamed man of God, and that's Eli, his sons, were they fit to continue? No, they weren't. Words came from prophecy. As I said, we'll look at these as we go along. So firstly, as we move in, let's go our first category. Let's establish there were non-writing prophets. I've named the main ones, but there'll be more, and we might well encounter those as we go along. So in our last remaining time, I'd like to just look at some of the female prophets. And these really are very, very interesting. Some of them we know a certain amount about, some we know very little about. So, where do we start? Now then, there was a respected place and position for prophets, both male and female, in ancient Israel and early Judaism, and also in the first century church. Prophets gained their place because of their unique abilities. They heard from God and spoke for God. Now it's interesting and important to know their speech did not always include foretelling. There are very often challenges to direct situations. So I'm just going to run very quickly through some of the female prophetesses, which we may look at in detail later, but this is basically by way of an introduction. In Judaism, Sarah is considered to be a prophet, and there are many legends that surround her, particularly surrounding the birth of the children, particularly concerning the movements towards Israel becoming a nation, and all kinds of these wonderful legends about her, and maybe we'll talk about those later. But strictly speaking, the first prophetess, I think, is Miriam. Now, there are 5 women who are identified as prophets in the Hebrew Bible, although there are generally considered to be 7. So I don't want to confuse you, but we'll just look at these as a start. Okay, so Miriam was the oldest sister of Moshe, the lawgiver, and Aaron, the high priest. All 3 siblings were prophets, and all 3 were leaders. And God reminds us, He reminds Judah of their leadership. Now, there's an interesting passage in Micah 6:4. For I brought you from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, and I send before you Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. So Micah is reminding us that part of redemption was through the prophets, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Now, the scriptures don't record any of Miriam's prophetic messages, but they do record a song that she sings. It's really quite fantastic, this. She's referred to as Neviah. So she took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women came out for her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider is thrown into the sea." Exodus 15:20-21. Now the words behind these, Chadem, sing, and Zero, are grammatically masculine. Now that's interesting, isn't it? This indicates that Miriam's audience included men, and she directed both men and women in this sing to the Lord. Now the thing that's interesting most of here is that prophecy was by performance. Now I'm going to do a whole session on this as we move along before we get into what I call the biggies. So Miriam is mentioned in 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and various narratives show she was a highly respected member of the community, and they tell she was a prophetess and a leader, even though her actions and messages are not recorded. So we're going to include Miriam in the non-writing prophets, even though she wasn't mentioned initially. A prophetess, a leader, and so much more. And even though Moshe is considered the greatest of maybe of all Jewish people who lived, we must not forget Aaron and Miriam, the 3 siblings who brought redemption from Israel. Quite remarkable when we think about it, isn't it? And we could talk much more about this, and we probably will. Now, Deborah is the only female judge mentioned in the book that carries the title, but she was also a prophetess. She's described as Neviah, and she's described as the wife or woman of Lapidot, and she was judging Israel at that time. I just love this, and it says she would sit under the palm tree of her own name. It's named after her between Ramah and Beitel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went to her to settle disputes in Judges 4, 4 and 5. Now, the thing I find quite remarkable here is, unlike many of the judges, there's not a bad word spoken about her character, but it's her action. She's an extremely effective spokesperson or representative of God, and her prophetic leadership extended to commanding Barak, the general of the army, and moreover, she was not afraid to follow up her words with actions, particularly in the war zone in Judges 4. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this because we're running out of time. So I'll speak more about Deborah. Then we've got this rather strange character, Isaiah's prophetess. Isaiah 8:3, her name isn't mentioned. It just says, "I went to the prophetess, the Neviah, and she conceived and bore a son." So there's some debate about the relationship with Isaiah. She may or may not have been his wife. There's also some debate whether she's truly a prophetess or if she's just been called Mrs. Prophet. Once again, we'll speak about this as we go on. Next is Huldah, who we find in both Kings and Chronicles, and again we'll speak about her later. Then we have Nochadiah, who's mentioned in a very short prayer, spoken by Nehemiah, and we'll speak about this much later. From there, we go on to Anna in the New Testament, in Luke's Gospel, I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then we also find Philip's daughters. So we'll speak about these a lot more, but I did want to introduce you to non-writing prophets and the female prophets before we start digging into it. From there, we'll obviously go on to the major prophets and the minor prophets. This will take some time, but it's important because these are the expressions of the 3-stranded cord and how God related his heart and his truth to his people, and subsequently to those of us who believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and believe in Messiah. I hope you're starting to get a little bit excited about this, because I certainly am. So, in the meantime, as ever, God be with you until we meet again.